How can I do authentication with my Next.js application? I know that I've personally stumbled on this a few times, and I wanted to make this video to help explain different authentication patterns with Next.js applications and talk about a few providers that you can use to add authentication to your application. Now, inside of Next.js, there are different patterns that you can use for authentication depending on the data fetching strategy that you want to use. And this boils down to two main strategies, either using static generation or server-side rendering. Using the static generation authentication pattern, you'll initially serve a loading state from the server, followed by loading your user information on the client side. Now, Next.js will automatically determine if a page should be generated statically if there's no blocking data requirements. So if you're not using get server-side props or get initial props, that page will automatically render as static HTML. In practice, this means that you can serve a loading state from the server, which has a really fast time to first byte, and then fetch that user information on the client side. One advantage of the static generation pattern is it allows your pages to be served from a global CDN because they're just static files, and then they can be preloaded using Next.js's link component. So when a page loads and it has links on that page, Next.js will intelligently prefetch those routes so that when a user clicks on them, it feels instant. Another advantage is that the hydration process for React, what you might consider as it booting up, can sometimes take some time. So instead of paying for that cost when you've already fetched the information on the server, while your page is in a loading state on the client side, you're also allowing React to hydrate and boot up on the client side as well. Now, this turns out to have a faster time to interactive. Okay, so what does this actually look like though? Let's look at an example using a profile page that you might use to show a user's information on the client side. So initially, this code is going to server render a loading skeleton if there's no user. Once that request finishes, then we will show the user's name, and if they're not logged in, then we can redirect to a login page. This is using a custom React hook we're calling useUser that will allow us to encapsulate that logic in one place and then reuse it across multiple places in our application. The second pattern for authentication is server-side rendering. So if you export a asynchronous function from your page called get server-side props, Next.js will fetch that data on the server and then forward it as a prop to the component inside of your page. So let's take our example from earlier that was statically generated and transform that to a server-side rendered profile page. You'll see that we still have the profile component at the top, but notice that there's no loading skeleton anymore. Instead, we're using get server-side props, and we're going to be fetching a user's session based on the request that comes in. If there's no session, we're going to redirect. But if there is a user, then we want to return the current session, which we can then use to display the user's name. It's worth mentioning here that Next.js has some in-flight improvements to improve the redirecting process in get server-side props. The biggest advantage of this pattern is that there's no flash of unauthenticated content. But with great power comes great responsibility. If the lookup between your server and fetching that user information is slow, it could potentially result in slow page load times. So you have to remember that when you're using get server-side props, it is blocking until that request resolves. So if the lookup between your request and fetching that user data is slow, it's going to result in a slower time to first byte. Okay, so those are the two different patterns that you can use. Let's look at some actual providers that we can use to implement authentication in our Next.js application. By far, the most popular is Firebase. Firebase has a great developer experience, and it makes it really easy to get off the ground fast and get user authentication in your application. Plus, it has a pretty generous free tier, which is really nice when you're just starting out on a hobby project or a beginning SaaS application. It's worth noting that the easiest pattern to use with Firebase is the static generation pattern using a custom React hook, but it is possible to do server-side rendered requests as well. Let's look at an example for what a client-side use authentication hook might look like for Firebase. In this example, you'll notice that not only are we doing a custom hook, but we're using React context as well. Now the reason for this is so that we wrap our application at the top in _app.js, which is used to share layout between pages in Next.js. Then we can use this custom use auth hook in any page, and the value is stored in one single location. So if we scroll down and we look at the use provide auth function, what we're going to do is store the user value in state with React state, and then we have a few functions here, one to sign in and then one to sign out. We return these functions at the bottom so that you can use these wherever you consume the hook. The last piece here is this use effect, which is an unsubscribe function so that when the auth state changes, it will log out the user and set the user to false. It's also worth mentioning that if you don't want to build this UI yourself, you can use the Firebase UI, specifically the React version, and it will give you all of the user interface out of the box hooked up with all the different providers. So I'll leave a link to that in the description below. The second most common option is probably bringing your own database. So if you already have a database out there that exists with some content or potentially some users as you're trying to migrate your application to Next.js, you're probably looking for some kind of open source solution that will allow you to add authentication to your application using your existing database. Now there's two great options for this. One is called Next-Session and the other is called next-auth. If you want to use JSON web tokens, consider using next-auth, especially if you want to add OAuth-based login for social providers like Google, Facebook, GitHub, etc. Makes it really easy to do that. The third option we're going to talk about is Magic Link. Magic is a passwordless based solution that you might have seen in clients like Slack. So it actually emails a login link to you, and then you click on that and boom, it just opens the application and logs you in. Similar to Firebase, you're probably going to use the client-side static generation pattern with Magic. On the client side, you're going to generate a unique ID and then forward that over to the server side where you can use Magic's Node SDK to log into your application and then save that user data as a cookie. The final provider I want to talk about is Auth0. You might have heard of Auth0. They're very popular in the authentication space, and they provide a great UI out of the box that makes it really easy to do email password-based login or login with any social providers. Using Auth0 with Next.js, you can utilize both of the authentication patterns. So let's take a look at an example using API routes, allowing us to log in and log out of a Next.js application. On the client side, after we initialize the Auth0 SDK, we could then call this login route, which is going to use the Auth0 library to log in. On the server, Auth0 populates the session, so you can utilize static generation or get server-side props for server-side rendering. Looking at an example of a profile page, you can utilize get server-side props to fetch that session and then either redirect to login or return the user as a prop to the component. One of the most common questions when trying to do authentication with Next.js is, how do I fetch my user data in one place and then use that across every page in the application? And there's really two answers. We'll talk about the one that you probably shouldn't use first. The first one is inside of _app.js, so the layout that wraps all of your routes. Currently, there's not support for get server-side props or get static props inside of this route, so you have to use get initial props, which runs on the client and the server. So if we look at this example using get initial props inside of app, we have this window check so that it only runs on the server, and then we can do something very similar like our previous Auth0 example to either redirect or return that user. And this would run on every page. Now, there's some caveats here. You should only use this if you have blocking data requirements for every page in your application, because in adding get initial props to app.js, it's going to opt out every single page in your application from static generation. So even if you have a marketing route like your pricing page and it doesn't do any data fetching, you don't want that page to render from the server. Ideally, you want that to be statically generated. So that's why, in general, we recommend not to use this approach. So let's talk about the second approach. The second approach is using get server-side props on each individual page. So this allows you to be much more granular about which specific pages do I want to require auth on. Let's take a look at an example. So if we create a function, require page auth, as a shared utility in like a library folder of sorts, we can use this to wrap get server-side props. So if we look at our profile example, if we want this page to be server-side rendered, we can change the export from get server-side props to use this require page auth, making sure that this route specifically will be rendered from the server, while it still allows other pages that might want to use static generation to not have to be server rendered. So that's it. Hopefully this helps demystify authentication in Next.js applications. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll get back to you. Thanks everyone.